He invited her to his wedding just to prove she was nothing without him. The words lingered in the air long before the ceremony even began, whispered between champagne flutes and polite laughter beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers that bathed the grand ballroom in gold, where every guest dressed in tailored suits and couture gowns had come not just to celebrate love, but to witness something else, something quieter, sharper, almost cruel, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, adjusting the cuff of his custom tuxedo, a subtle smirk playing at the corner of his lips as he scanned the entrance like a man waiting for a performance he had carefully scripted. Beside him, Sophia Lane shimmered in ivory silk, her diamond ring catching the light as she leaned in and murmured something that made him chuckle. But his eyes never left the doors, because tonight was never really about the wedding. It was about closure, or at least the version of closure he wanted the world to see. A final act where the past would walk in, diminished and forgotten. And he would stand victorious, untouchable, admired. The man who moved on and leveled up. And somewhere across the city, miles away from the marble floors and curated perfection, Evelyn Carter sat in the back of a long black car, the soft hum of the engine barely louder than her own breathing as streetlights flickered across the window, painting her reflection in fragments of light and shadow. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers grazing the fabric of a dress he had never seen, a deep emerald silk that caught even the faintest light and held it like a secret. And for a moment her eyes closed, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in stillness, as if she were stepping into something already decided long before tonight, because she knew exactly what this was, not an invitation, not a reconciliation, but a stage built by a man who believed he still controlled the narrative, who believed she would walk in smaller, quieter, less than she once was, and the memory of his voice, sharp and dismissive, flickered through her mind like a distant echo, the way he used to say her name like it was something temporary, something replaceable. And outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware that somewhere between glass towers and silent streets, a story was about to shift. And back inside the ballroom, the music softened, conversations dipped into anticipation, and Daniel straightened slightly as the doors at the far end of the room began to open, just a fraction at first, enough to let in a sliver of cool night air and something else, something none of them could quite name yet. And for the first time that evening, the room didn't feel like it belonged to him anymore. The doors opened wider, slow enough to stretch every second into something unbearable, and the room seemed to inhale all at once as conversations thinned into whispers, the soft clink of champagne glasses fading into a silence that felt almost deliberate. And Daniel felt it before he fully saw her. That subtle shift in the air, the kind that could not be controlled or rehearsed. His fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass as his gaze locked forward, expecting hesitation, expecting discomfort, expecting the woman he once knew to walk in carrying the weight of everything he had taken from her. But what stepped through those doors was something else entirely, something unfamiliar in the most unsettling way. Evelyn Carter moved with a quiet precision, each step measured, her heels striking the marble floor with a rhythm that cut clean through the silence. The emerald silk of her dress catching the chandelier light and reflecting it back in soft waves, not loud, not desperate for attention, but impossible to ignore. And the closer she came, the more the room seemed to adjust around her, shoulders turning, voices dropping. Even the servers pausing mid-step as if instinctively aware that something had shifted beyond the script of the evening. And Sophia's smile faltered just slightly, a flicker so brief it might have gone unnoticed, but Daniel saw it, and something in his chest tightened in response. Not fear, not yet, but something adjacent, something unfamiliar, and he forced a laugh under his breath, leaning closer to Sophia as if to anchor himself, whispering that it was just a show, just an entrance. But his voice lacked the certainty it had held moments ago, because Evelyn was not looking at him the way he expected. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no trace of the woman who once searched his face for approval. Instead, there was calm, a stillness that felt deliberate, like she had already moved past the moment he had spent weeks trying to orchestrate. And as she reached the center of the room, the whispers grew louder, fragments of recognition threading through the crowd, names half-spoken, questions forming in hushed tones, because people were starting to notice details that did not belong to the version of her they remembered. The cut of the dress, the confidence in her posture, the quiet presence of the men who had entered just moments after her and now stood at a respectful distance, their tailored suits sharp, their attention focused not on the room, but on her. And Daniel's grip tightened further as the realization began to edge into his awareness that this was no longer something he controlled, that whatever narrative he had planned was already slipping through his fingers. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, to reclaim the moment, to remind the room who this night was supposed to belong to, a voice from near the stage rose above the silence, smooth and formal, cutting cleanly through the tension as it began to introduce her. And in that single instant, before the words fully landed, Daniel understood something he had not prepared for. That the woman walking toward him was not here to be judged, not here to be diminished, and not here to play the role he had assigned her. And for the first time that evening, he was no longer certain how this would end. The name landed like a quiet detonation, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. As the voice finished the introduction with calm authority, Evelyn Carter, primary heir to the Whitmore Group, and for a fraction of a second the room did not react at all, as if everyone needed time to recalibrate what they had just heard. And then it came, not in a burst, but in a ripple, whispers turning into sharp intakes of breath, eyes widening, heads turning fully now, no longer pretending. Indifference, because Whitmore was not just a name, it was influence, it was generational wealth, it was the kind of power that did not need to announce itself. And Daniel felt it in the way the space around him shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the attention that had once gravitated toward him now bending, almost instinctively, toward her, and beside him Sophia's fingers tightened around his arm, her posture stiffening as the confidence she had worn so effortlessly began to crack at the edges. And still Evelyn did not rush, did not speak. She simply stood there for a moment as if allowing the room to catch up, her gaze moving calmly across the faces that had once watched her fall apart, people who had turned away, who had chosen silence over support, and now looked at her as if trying to rewrite their own memories in real time. And when her eyes finally met Daniel's, there was no anger there, no bitterness, just a quiet clarity that unsettled him far more than any accusation ever could, because it meant she did not need anything from him anymore, not an apology, not recognition, not even acknowledgement, and he swallowed, the confident script he had prepared dissolving in his mind as he searched for something to say that would restore the balance he had lost. But nothing came, only the faint awareness that every word he could choose would sound smaller than the silence she held, and she stepped closer, closing the distance he had once controlled, the soft sound of her heels echoing in the space that now belonged to her. And when she stopped in front of him, the room leaned in without realizing it, waiting for impact, for confrontation, for something dramatic to justify the tension that had built. But Evelyn only offered a small, composed smile, the kind that did not ask for approval or permission, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, almost gentle. "Congratulations, Daniel. I truly hope this is everything you wanted." And that was it. No edge, no accusation, just a sentence so simple it left no space for defense, because it did not attack, it did not engage, it simply existed above him. And for the first time Daniel understood the full weight of what had happened, that this night he had designed as her humiliation had become something else entirely, something he could not reclaim, because she had not come to fight for her place in his world. She had outgrown it completely. And as she turned, the movement effortless, the room parted without being asked, people stepping aside instinctively as she walked back toward the doors, not rushed, not lingering, just leaving on her own terms. And Daniel remained where he was, surrounded by the same guests, the same lights, the same carefully planned celebration, but nothing felt the same anymore, because the spotlight he had built was no longer his. And somewhere between the silence she left behind and the whispers rising again, a single realization settled in with quiet certainty. He had invited her to witness his victory, but instead, he had just witnessed hers. The doors closed softly behind her, but the echo of her presence lingered in the room like a note that refused to fade, and for a long moment no one moved, as if the entire ballroom had been suspended between what was planned and what had just happened. And Daniel stood there still, the weight of his own silence pressing heavier than anything she could have said, the glass in his hand untouched, forgotten. While across the room conversations began again, but not the same as before, not light or celebratory, instead quieter, sharper, threaded with something new, curiosity, recalculation, and a shift in allegiance that no one dared to acknowledge out loud. And Sophia slowly released her grip on his arm, her fingers retreating as if contact itself had become uncertain, her eyes following the direction Evelyn had disappeared, her posture no longer the effortless confidence she had worn like a second skin, but something more guarded, more aware, as though the room itself had turned into a mirror reflecting something she did not expect to see. And Daniel finally exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, but it did not bring relief. Only clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. Because the narrative he had built, the careful structure of control, of image, of dominance, had collapsed. Not with force, but with absence. She had not argued, not defended herself, not even stayed long enough to be diminished, and that absence had stripped him of the one thing he relied on, the ability to define her, to define the story. And now the room no longer needed his version, because they had seen something else entirely, something that did not fit inside the boundaries he had drawn. And as the music resumed, tentative at first, like a machine restarting after interruption, Daniel became aware of the space around him, how it felt wider, emptier, despite being filled with people. And when he glanced toward the stage, toward the place where moments ago he had stood at the center of attention, it no longer held the same weight, as if the significance had shifted and taken root somewhere beyond his reach. And a few guests approached, offering polite smiles, congratulations that sounded rehearsed, but their eyes flickered, just for a second, carrying questions they did not voice. And he nodded, responded automatically, his voice steady, practiced, but beneath it something had fractured, something subtle yet irreversible. Because for the first time he understood that control was not about who spoke the loudest, or who stood at the center. It was about who no longer needed to stand there at all. And across the city, the black car moved smoothly through the night, the glow of streetlights sliding across its surface like passing thoughts. And inside, Evelyn sat in quiet stillness, her reflection once again fractured by glass and light. But this time there was no tension in her posture, no lingering weight in her gaze, only a calm that felt earned, not given, her fingers resting lightly against the cool leather seat as the city unfolded ahead of her, not as a place of memory, but as something new, something she now stepped into without looking back. And she did not check her phone, did not wonder what they were saying, because she already knew the only thing that mattered had already happened, not the moment they recognized her name, not the shift in the room, but the moment she realized she no longer needed any of it. And as the car disappeared into the rhythm of the city, one truth settled quietly into place. The story he had tried to end tonight had not ended at all. It had simply moved beyond him, and he was no longer part of where it was going. The music regained its rhythm, but it no longer carried the same confidence, each note sounding slightly misplaced, as if even the orchestra sensed the shift that had settled over the room. And Daniel found himself moving through conversations he could not fully hear, nodding at words that barely registered, his attention pulled somewhere else entirely, replaying the moment she walked in, not the dress, not the announcement, but the way she looked at him, as if he were already part of something finished, something closed. And it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because he had prepared for anger, for confrontation, for anything that would confirm he still held a place in her story. But what she gave him instead was distance, complete and unshakable. And it was that absence that lingered now, louder than any argument could have been. And across the room Sophia adjusted her posture again, smoothing the fabric of her gown as if trying to restore the version of the evening she had imagined. But the glances she received had changed, subtle yet unmistakable, curiosity replacing admiration, and she could feel it, the way attention no longer rested comfortably on her, the way comparisons began to form in silence, unspoken but present. And Daniel noticed it too, the shift in how people looked at them, not openly disrespectful, but no longer unquestioningly impressed. And it was in that moment he realized something he had never considered before, that influence was not only about what you displayed, but about what others believed without needing proof. And tonight that belief had moved, quietly but decisively, away from him. And as the ceremony resumed, vows spoken under the same chandeliers that had witnessed the turning of the room, Daniel repeated the words expected of him, his voice steady, his posture perfect, but behind it there was a fracture, a faint but persistent awareness that something had slipped beyond his reach, and no matter how carefully he maintained the image, it would not return. And later, as the reception stretched into the evening, laughter rose again, glasses clinked, and the dance floor filled with motion. But for Daniel it all felt distant, like watching a version of his own life from just outside of it, every detail correct, every moment in place, and yet something essential missing. And miles away the city lights reflected across the windows of a high-rise office overlooking the skyline, where Evelyn now stood alone. The quiet hum of the building wrapping around her like a second silence, the emerald dress now softened by shadow, its brilliance no longer necessary, as she set her clutch gently on a polished desk and allowed herself a single slow breath, not of relief, not of triumph, but of completion, because what happened tonight was never about proving anything to him or to them. It was about stepping fully into a version of herself that no longer required validation from the past. And as she looked out over the city, the reflection staring back at her was no longer fragmented, no longer uncertain. It was whole, composed, and entirely her own. And somewhere far behind her, in a ballroom filled with light and noise, a man stood surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, slowly realizing that none of it felt the same anymore, because the one thing he tried to control had become the one thing he could never reach again. And the silence she left behind was not empty, it was final. It did not happen all at once, not like a dramatic collapse or a single moment of realization, but in small, precise fractures that began the moment the night ended, when the lights dimmed and the guests filtered out into the cool early morning air, carrying with them not just memories of a wedding, but something far more compelling, a story that had shifted in real time. And Daniel could feel it in the way conversations lingered just a second too long before stopping when he approached, in the way eyes met his and then moved away with polite neutrality instead of admiration. And even as he stood beside Sophia greeting the last of the guests, his smile felt heavier, less automatic, as if it required effort to maintain, because somewhere beneath the surface of everything that had gone according to plan, something essential had unraveled, and it followed him into the days that came after, into boardrooms and meetings where he had always been certain of his presence, where his voice had once carried weight without question, but now there was hesitation, subtle but undeniable, as colleagues paused before agreeing, as decisions were reconsidered, as if an invisible recalibration had taken place, and he found himself speaking more, explaining more, filling silences that had never needed to be filled before, because the confidence that once surrounded him no longer arrived on its own. And across the city, in a space of glass and quiet authority, Evelyn moved through her own world with a rhythm that did not need adjustment, her days structured not around reaction, but intention, meetings that unfolded with clarity, conversations that carried purpose, and people who listened not out of obligation, but respect. And there was no need for announcement, no need to remind anyone of who she was, because it was already understood, woven into the way doors opened before she reached them, into the way voices softened just slightly when she spoke. And yet beneath that composed surface, there were moments, brief and private, when the past brushed against her thoughts, not as pain, but as something distant, something she could observe without being pulled back into. And on one such afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of her office, casting long lines across the polished floor, her assistant stepped in quietly, placing a file on her desk. "A proposal," she said, "from Brooks Enterprises," and the name settled into the room with a familiarity that no longer held weight. And Evelyn's gaze rested on the folder for a moment, not tense, not hesitant, simply aware, as if acknowledging a chapter she had already finished. And when she finally opened it, the pages revealed what she already suspected, a request, carefully worded, professionally structured, but unmistakable in its intent, an attempt to reconnect, to align, to regain proximity to something he now understood he had lost, and she read it without expression, without reaction, the quiet hum of the office continuing around her as if the world itself did not pause for this kind of moment anymore. And somewhere, miles away, Daniel sat in his own office, the city stretching out beyond his window, waiting, not for an answer, but for something else entirely, something he could not quite name, a restoration, perhaps, or a reversal. A belief that what had shifted could somehow be corrected, but what he did not understand, not yet, was that some distances are not measured in miles or time, but in something far more permanent, something that does not close once it has been fully seen. And as Evelyn closed the file gently and placed it back on her desk, one truth settled into place with quiet certainty. The story that once connected them had not just ended, it had evolved beyond recognition. And whatever came next would not be written from where it began. She did not respond immediately, not because she needed time to decide, but because the decision had already been made long before the proposal ever reached her desk, and still she allowed the file to remain there, unopened again, untouched, as if giving it space to exist without giving it power. And outside her office the day continued with quiet efficiency, assistants moving with purpose, conversations flowing in low, controlled tones, a world that functioned without interruption, without urgency, because nothing in it depended on the past she had already left behind. And yet across the city Daniel checked his phone more often than he would admit, each vibration pulling his attention with a subtle urgency he could not dismiss, his expectations shifting from confidence to anticipation, then to something quieter, something closer to doubt, as hours stretched into a day and the absence of a response began to take shape, not as rejection, but as something more definitive, something that did not require words to be understood, and it unsettled him in a way that forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding, that influence could not be reclaimed simply by reaching out, that proximity did not guarantee relevance, and that some doors, once closed, did not reopen no matter how carefully one knocked. And still he told himself it was timing, that she was busy, that the world she moved in now operated on a different rhythm. And yet beneath those explanations was the quiet awareness that perhaps she had already seen everything she needed to see, and chosen silence as her answer. And back in her office, Evelyn finally reached for the file again, not with hesitation, but with clarity, flipping through the pages once more, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, because this was no longer about emotion, no longer about what had been lost or taken, but about what aligned with who she had become. And when she reached the final page, she closed it gently, her fingers resting on the cover for just a moment before she spoke, her voice calm, measured, instructing her assistant to decline the proposal, professionally, respectfully, without explanation. And the simplicity of that decision carried more weight than any justification could have, because it was not reactive, not defensive, it was final. And as the assistant nodded and stepped away, the file disappeared from her desk, from her space, from her present, and somewhere else Daniel's phone remained silent, the screen dark, reflecting only his own image back at him as he sat waiting for something that would not arrive. And in that quiet he began to understand that what unsettled him was not the rejection itself, but the absence of significance behind it, the realization that he was no longer central to a story he once controlled, no longer even a variable that required consideration. And as evening settled over the city, lights flickering on one by one, Evelyn stood once more by the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, not as a symbol of what she had gained, but as a reminder of what she no longer needed to prove. And the silence that surrounded her was not empty. It was complete, carrying within it a certainty that did not waver, that did not look back. And in that stillness one truth remained, quiet and unshakable. She had not just moved on from him. She had moved beyond the version of herself that ever needed him to see her at all. The city moved forward, indifferent and steady, but for Daniel time had begun to feel uneven, stretched in places where certainty used to exist, and compressed into sharp moments of realization he could no longer ignore. And it showed not in anything dramatic, but in the subtle shifts that followed him through his days, the way meetings ended without the same assurance, the way conversations no longer bent naturally in his favor, and most of all, The way silence had begun to replace the easy confidence he once carried, because silence now meant something different. It was no longer a space he controlled, but one that revealed what had changed, and despite everything he told himself, despite the structure he maintained, the image he upheld, there was a growing awareness that something essential had moved beyond his reach, and it was not returning. And across the city, Evelyn continued forward without interruption, her schedule unfolding with precision, her presence steady in rooms that once would have intimidated her, but now felt aligned with who she had become, and there was no trace of performance in the way she carried herself, no need to prove, no need to remind, because the world she moved in now responded to something deeper than appearance. It responded to certainty, and that certainty had been built quietly, far from the places that once tried to diminish her. And yet, even in that calm progression, the past lingered not as a burden, but as context, a distant echo that occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways, like the article she glanced at one morning, a small feature buried within a business column, mentioning Brooks Enterprises, its recent challenges, its shifting position in a market that had grown less forgiving, and she read it without emotion, without satisfaction, simply acknowledging it as part of a larger pattern. Because what was happening to him was not something she had caused, it was something he had set in motion long before she ever stepped back into that room. And for a moment, she considered how easily their paths could have remained intertwined, how different things might have looked if she had chosen to stay within the version of herself he understood. But that thought passed quickly, dissolving as soon as it formed, because it no longer held relevance. And later that afternoon, as she moved through a quiet hallway lined with glass and light, she paused briefly, her reflection catching in one of the panels. And for a second, she simply stood there, not examining, not questioning, just observing the woman she had become, composed, grounded, untouched by the need to revisit what had already been resolved. And miles away, Daniel sat alone in his office, the city stretching out before him in the same way it always had, but feeling different now, less like a reflection of success and more like a reminder of distance, of how quickly perception could shift when it was no longer reinforced. And as he leaned back in his chair, the silence around him no longer felt like control, it felt like absence, the kind that could not be filled by effort alone. And in that quiet space, one truth began to settle in with a clarity he could no longer avoid, that what he had lost was never about her presence, but about what she represented, a version of himself that had only existed while she remained within his reach. And now that she had stepped beyond it, that version had faded with her, leaving behind something far less certain. And somewhere else in the city, Evelyn continued forward, not looking back, not because she refused to, but because there was simply nothing left behind that required her attention anymore. It was no longer just a feeling, no longer something subtle or easily dismissed, but something that began to take form in ways Daniel could not ignore, numbers that did not align the way they used to, conversations that ended without commitment, opportunities that quietly shifted direction, and each of them on their own could have been explained, justified, smoothed over with the confidence he had relied on for years. But together they formed a pattern, one that pointed to a reality he had not prepared for. That influence, once questioned, did not simply return on demand, and he found himself working harder to maintain what had once come naturally, staying later in the office, reviewing details he would have once delegated, speaking with more precision, more control, as if effort alone could restore what had been lost. But beneath that effort there was something else, something quieter, a recognition that no matter how carefully he adjusted, the perception had already shifted, and across the city Evelyn continued to move through her world with the same steady rhythm, her presence no longer defined by contrast, not by what she had escaped, but by what she had built in its absence. And there was a meeting that afternoon, one of many, held in a conference room that overlooked the skyline, sunlight reflecting off glass towers and casting a soft glow across the polished table, where executives spoke in measured tones, outlining projections, discussing strategy. And when it was her turn to speak, the room settled into a silence that was not forced, but chosen, because what she said carried weight without needing to be emphasized, her voice calm, her words deliberate, and when she finished there was no hesitation in the responses that followed, only alignment, only forward motion, and for a brief moment, As she listened, she was aware of how different this felt from the room she once occupied, where her voice had been secondary, where her presence had been defined by association, and that awareness did not bring satisfaction. It brought clarity, a quiet understanding of how far she had moved, not just in status, but in identity. And later, as the meeting concluded and people began to gather their things, one of the senior partners paused beside her, mentioning a potential acquisition, a company that had come up unexpectedly, one that might align with their current expansion. And as he spoke, the name surfaced with a familiarity that did not disrupt her composure. Brooks Enterprises. And for a moment the space held still, not externally, but within her. A brief pause where past and present intersected without conflict, and she considered it not as a personal matter, not as something tied to history, but as a decision, one that would be made based on value, on direction, on what served the future she had already stepped into. And miles away Daniel sat at his desk, reviewing documents that felt increasingly complex, not because they were different, but because his position within them had changed. And when his phone buzzed, he glanced at it with the same expectation that had not fully left him. But the message was not what he had hoped for, not a response, not a reopening, but something else entirely, a request for information, formal, structured, originating from a firm he recognized immediately. And as he read it, a quiet realization settled in, not sharp, not sudden, but undeniable, that whatever connection he once believed he could restore was no longer his to initiate. And for the first time he understood that the distance between them was not something that could be closed by reaching out, because it no longer existed on terms he controlled. And somewhere else, in a room filled with light and quiet authority, Evelyn stood at the window once more, the city stretching endlessly before her, not as something to conquer, but as something she already belonged to. And in that stillness one truth remained, steady and unchanging. She had not just rewritten her story, she had changed the ground it was written on, and anyone who stepped into it now would do so on her terms. The request did not feel like coincidence, and it did not arrive with urgency, but it carried a quiet inevitability that neither of them could ignore. As the formal inquiry moved through channels with precision, numbers outlined, projections attached, every detail presented with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. And when it reached Evelyn, it was no longer just a name from the past. It was a decision positioned in the present, one that required no emotion, only judgment. And she reviewed it the same way she reviewed everything else, calmly, thoroughly, without hesitation, her eyes moving across the figures, the structure, the underlying instability that had begun to surface beneath the polished exterior. And she understood immediately what it represented, not an opportunity born from strength, but one emerging from vulnerability. A shift in leverage that had not existed before. And across the city Daniel sat in a conference room that felt colder than usual, though nothing about it had changed. The same long table, the same muted tones, the same skyline stretching beyond the glass. But the atmosphere carried a different weight now, quieter, more cautious, as his team spoke in measured voices, outlining options, strategies, contingencies. And though they did not say it directly, the reality was clear. They needed alignment, they needed backing, they needed something that would stabilize what was beginning to slip. And as the conversation moved forward, Daniel remained composed, asking the right questions, offering direction, maintaining the image of control he had built over years. But beneath it, there was a growing awareness that this was no longer a position he could navigate alone. And when the meeting ended, he lingered for a moment, the room emptying around him, his reflection faint in the glass as he looked out over a city that once felt like an extension of his own ambition, and now felt distant, as if it no longer responded in the same way. And somewhere else Evelyn closed the file once more, her decision forming not as a reaction, but as a continuation of the path she had already chosen, because this was never about him, not anymore. It was about what made sense within the world she had built. And as she stood from her desk and walked toward the window, the city unfolded beneath her, vast and steady, untouched by the weight of individual stories. And in that moment, she understood the simplicity of what came next, not as a question of whether she would engage, but how. And when her assistant entered quietly, awaiting instruction, Evelyn spoke with the same calm clarity that defined everything she did. "Prepare a formal meeting," she said, "not as a favor, not as a reconciliation, but as a business discussion, structured, precise, on her terms." And miles away, Daniel's phone lit up once more, the notification brief. Professional, confirming what he had been waiting for without offering anything more. And as he read it, a shift settled into place. Not relief, not confidence, but something far more measured, because for the first time he understood that this was no longer an interaction between equals, not a conversation shaped by shared history, but a negotiation defined by distance, by changed positions, by a balance that had already moved. And as he stood there, the weight of that realization quiet but undeniable, one truth became clear in a way it never had before, that whatever happened next would not be determined by who he used to be, but by who she had become. The meeting was scheduled without ceremony, without anticipation, placed neatly into the calendar like any other obligation. And yet when the day arrived, the atmosphere carried a weight that neither of them could fully ignore, not because of what was said, but because of everything that had already been understood before a single word was spoken. And Daniel arrived early, stepping into the conference room with a composure that had been carefully reconstructed, his posture precise, his expression neutral, as if preparation alone could restore the balance he once carried so effortlessly. And the room itself reflected a different kind of power, understated but undeniable, clean lines, soft light filtering through expansive windows, a space designed not to impress, but to affirm, and he noticed it immediately, the absence of excess, the quiet confidence embedded in every detail. And when Evelyn entered, she did not pause, did not acknowledge the past that hung silently between them. She simply stepped into the room as she would any other, her presence steady, her attention already focused on what mattered. And for a brief moment their eyes met, not as they once had, not searching, not reactive, but clear, composed, and entirely without expectation. And that was where the difference revealed itself most sharply, not in status, not in circumstance, but in distance, the kind that could not be measured or bridged. And as they took their seats, the conversation began with the same structure as any negotiation: numbers, projections, terms, each point laid out with clarity and precision. But beneath it, there was an unspoken awareness that this was not just a transaction, it was a realignment. And Daniel found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing the direction, the control with which she guided the discussion, not forceful, not dominating, but certain, and each response she gave carried a finality that left no space for interpretation. And it became clear to him that this was not an opportunity extended out of obligation or memory, but one defined entirely by her terms, her assessment, her vision. And at one point, as the conversation paused briefly, he spoke, not to negotiate, not to persuade, but simply to ask, his voice measured, quieter than it once would have been. "How long have you been planning this?" And the question lingered for a moment, not heavy, but unnecessary, and Evelyn regarded him with the same calm expression, her answer arriving without hesitation. "I have not been planning this," she said. "I have been building something that does not require the past to define it." And the simplicity of her response settled into the room with a clarity that did not need expansion. And Daniel nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because in that moment he understood something he had not fully grasped before, that this was never about proving him wrong, never about reclaiming anything he had taken. It was about creating something entirely separate, something that existed beyond his reach from the very beginning. And as the meeting continued, the terms finalized, the structure agreed upon, the outcome became inevitable, not as a victory for either side, but as a reflection of where they now stood. And when it ended, there was no lingering, no attempt to extend the moment, only a brief acknowledgement, professional, composed. And as Evelyn gathered her documents and stood to leave, the room remained unchanged, the same light, the same quiet. But Daniel felt it differently now, not as a space he had entered, but as one he had stepped into too late. And as the door closed behind her, one realization settled with a certainty that could not be undone. He had spent so long believing he was ahead of her story, that he had never considered the possibility that she had already moved beyond his entirely. There was no applause, no announcement, No moment where the world paused to acknowledge what had just been set into motion, because the kind of shift that had occurred between them did not need witnesses. It existed quietly, firmly, in the decisions that followed, and as the agreement moved forward, finalized in documents and signatures, it carried with it a weight that neither of them needed to name, not as a victory, not as a loss, but as a conclusion that had been forming long before they ever sat across from each other again. And Daniel returned to his office with the same composed exterior he had perfected over the years. But the silence that greeted him there felt different now, not uncertain, not uneasy, but clear in a way it had never been before, as if the space itself reflected a truth he could no longer reshape. And as he set the folder down on his desk, he did not open it immediately, his hand resting briefly against its surface as he looked out at the skyline. The city still vast, still moving, still filled with opportunity, but no longer centered around him in the way he had once believed. And for the first time, he did not search for a way to reclaim that position. He simply acknowledged its absence. And in that acknowledgement, there was something unexpected, not defeat, but understanding, the kind that arrives only when resistance fades. And he thought of her, not as she had been, not as the version he once dismissed, but as the person who had walked into that room and spoken without needing to prove anything, who had moved through every moment with a certainty that did not rely on him. And it became clear to him that what he had witnessed was not a transformation that happened overnight, not a sudden rise or a calculated return, but the result of something built quietly, consistently, beyond his line of sight. And across the city, Evelyn continued with her day without pause. The meeting already filed away as one of many, its significance defined not by who it involved, but by what it aligned with. And there was no reflection, no revisiting, only forward movement, the kind that did not look back because it had already outgrown the need to. And as she stepped into another room, another conversation, her presence remained unchanged, steady, composed, fully rooted in the life she had created. And in that quiet continuity, there was a clarity that extended beyond any single moment, a recognition that the past no longer held any authority over her present, not because it had been erased, but because it had been understood, absorbed, and ultimately released. And somewhere within that understanding, a final balance settled into place, not between them, but within themselves. And as the city shifted from afternoon into evening, lights beginning to flicker on across the skyline, one truth remained, simple and unspoken, that what had once been a story of loss and humiliation had resolved not through confrontation or retaliation, but through distance, growth, and the quiet power of becoming something that no longer needed to return at all. The city did not mark the ending. It did not pause or soften. It simply continued, as it always had. But somewhere within its quiet rhythm, two lives moved forward on paths that would no longer intersect, not by distance, not by circumstance, but by choice. And in that separation, there was no tension left to resolve, no unfinished words waiting to be spoken, only a clarity that had settled fully into place. And Daniel stood once more by the window of his office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, no longer as a reflection of what he controlled, but as something far larger, something that had never truly belonged to him in the way he once believed. And as he watched the lights flicker on one by one, he understood that what had changed was not the city, not the opportunities, not even the world he moved in, but the way he fit within it, the quiet shift from certainty to awareness, from assumption to understanding. And for the first time, he did not reach for what had been lost. He did not attempt to rewrite or reclaim. He simply stood there and let the realization exist that some things do not return because they were never meant to remain. And across the city, Evelyn stepped out onto a terrace high above the streets, the air cool against her skin, the distant hum of traffic blending into a steady, grounding rhythm. And she paused there, not to reflect, not to revisit, but simply to exist within the life she had built, her gaze moving across the skyline without searching for anything within it, because there was nothing left to find, nothing left to prove. And the silence around her was not heavy, not filled with memory. It was open, expansive, carrying with it a sense of completion that did not need to be defined. And in that stillness, there was a truth that no longer needed words, that the power she held had never come from being seen by him or by anyone else, but from the moment she chose to see herself without the weight of what had once diminished her. And as she turned to go back inside, the light from the room behind her casting a soft glow across the terrace,